The shovel struck metal with a hollow clang that seemed to echo across the entire valley. Samuel Morrison froze, his weathered hands still gripping the wooden handle, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool October air. 3 feet down in the hard-packed earth behind his barn, something waited in the darkness. "Please don't lift it," the woman whispered from behind him, her voice barely audible above the wind rustling through the cottonwoods. He'd found her that morning, collapsed near his fence line, clutching a faded photograph and mumbling about things that needed to stay buried. Clara Whitmore, he'd recognized her despite the years that had carved deep lines around her eyes. She'd been beautiful once, before whatever had happened to her in the years since she'd left Millbrook County. Samuel's ranch sat at the edge of civilization, where the rolling grasslands met the unforgiving desert. 23 years he'd worked this land, raised cattle, minded his own business. He'd built a reputation as a man who asked few questions and expected the same courtesy in return. But Clara's arrival had shattered that peace like a stone through window glass. She'd begged him to dig here, pointing to a spot with trembling fingers, then immediately pleaded with him to stop. Her contradictions made no sense, but the desperation in her voice had convinced him to take up the shovel. Now, staring down at the metallic glint in the dark earth, he wondered if some things were better left undisturbed. The object appeared to be a small chest, no bigger than a cigar box, its brass corners green with age. Dirt filled the intricate engravings on its surface, but even through the grime, Samuel could make out what looked like initials, E.M. His breath caught. Those were his father's initials. Edmund Morrison had died when Samuel was barely 16, leaving him this ranch and 1,000 unanswered questions about the man who'd raised him in stern silence. Clara stepped closer, her boots crunching on the scattered dirt. "Some secrets die with the people who made them," she said, her voice hollow. "This one should have died with your father." Samuel's hands tightened on the shovel handle. In all his years of working this land, he'd never found anything buried here. His father had been a careful man, methodical in everything he did. If Edmund Morrison had buried something behind the barn, he'd had a reason, and that reason had been important enough to keep hidden for over 2 decades. The silence stretched between them, like a taut wire, ready to snap. "My father was an honest man," Samuel said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. He knelt beside the hole, studying the chest without touching it. "Whatever this is, there's a reasonable explanation." Clara let out a bitter laugh. "Honest men don't bury secrets in the middle of the night." She moved closer, her shadow falling across the excavated earth. "I was there, Samuel. I saw what he did." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire. Samuel's jaw clenched. His father had been the foundation of everything he believed about right and wrong, about building something lasting in this harsh country. Edmund Morrison had taught him that a man's word was his bond, that hard work and integrity were the only currencies that mattered. "You've been gone 20 years, Samuel said, rising to his feet but keeping his eyes on the chest. "Whatever you think you remember, I remember blood," Clara interrupted, her voice cutting through his denial like a blade. "I remember your father standing over Thomas Brennan's body, and I remember the way the moonlight caught the silver in that man's hair when they dragged him away." Thomas Brennan, Samuel's breath caught. He'd heard that name whispered in saloons, always followed by speculation about where the wealthy rancher had disappeared to one night in 1878. Some said he'd run off with another man's wife. Others claimed he'd been killed by rustlers on the trail to Denver, but no one had ever found a body, and no one had ever been charged. "You're lying," Samuel said, but his voice lacked conviction. Clara reached into her coat and withdrew the photograph she'd been clutching, a tintype of 3 people standing in front of this very barn. Samuel recognized his father immediately, younger but wearing the same stern expression he remembered. Beside Edmund stood a man in an expensive suit, smiling broadly, and between them, looking radiant in a white dress, was Clara herself. "Thomas Brennan was my husband," she said quietly. "He came here that night to buy cattle from your father. They'd done business before, but something went wrong. I heard the shouting from inside the house, and when I came running," she trailed off, her eyes fixed on the buried chest. "Your father was already digging." Samuel stared at the photograph, his world tilting on its axis. The woman in the image looked nothing like the broken creature standing before him now. This Clara had been full of life, her eyes bright with hope and love. What stood before him was a ghost, haunted by decades of carrying an unbearable truth. "Why didn't you go to the law?" he asked. "With what proof? Your father was respected, connected. I was just a young woman whose husband had mysteriously vanished." Clara's voice carried 20 years of bitterness. "So I ran, changed my name, tried to forget. But some things won't stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the hole." The sound of hoofbeats echoed across the valley, still distant but growing closer. Clara's head snapped up, fear flashing across her weathered features. "They followed me," she whispered. "I should have known they would." The riders appeared on the horizon like dark specks against the amber sky, but Samuel could already count 6 of them. They rode hard, their horses kicking up dust clouds that stretched behind them like the wake of a ship. Clara grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve with desperate strength. "They've been hunting me for weeks," she said, her voice tight with panic. "Ever since I started asking questions in town about what really happened to Thomas." Samuel's mind raced. 6 armed men meant serious trouble, the kind that ended with graves being dug or necks being stretched. In this part of the country, justice often came at the end of a rope, and questions were asked later, if at all. "Who are they?" he demanded. But Clara was already backing away from the hole, her eyes fixed on the approaching riders. "Thomas had brothers," she said, "rich brothers who never believed he just disappeared. They hired detectives, bounty hunters, anyone who might find answers. When word got out that Edmund Morrison's widow was asking about that night, she shook her head. They knew I was the key to the truth." The chest gleamed in the afternoon sun, a metallic accusation waiting to be opened. Samuel could hear the thunder of hoofbeats growing louder, could almost feel the noose tightening around his neck. Whatever evidence lay inside that box could destroy everything he'd built, everything his father's name had meant in this community, but it could also be the only thing that might save Clara's life. "Open it," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through his paralysis. "If we're going to face them, we need to know what we're facing them with." Samuel's hands trembled as he reached for the chest. The metal was cold against his palms, heavier than he'd expected. The lock had long since rusted away, and the lid opened with a grinding screech that seemed to announce their doom to the approaching riders. Inside, nestled in rotted velvet, lay a collection of items that made Samuel's blood run cold. A pocket watch, its gold surface engraved with the initials TB, a wedding ring delicate and expensive, and beneath them wrapped in oiled cloth, a bundle of papers tied with string. Clara leaned over his shoulder, her breath catching as she recognized the watch. "Thomas's grandfather gave him that," she whispered. "He never went anywhere without it." Samuel's hands shook as he untied the string and unfolded the papers. The top document was a deed, a legal transfer of ownership for the Brennan Ranch, signed by Thomas Brennan and witnessed by Edmund Morrison. But the signature looked wrong, the letters shaky and uncertain, as if written under duress. Below that lay a confession, written in his father's careful handwriting. Samuel's eyes scanned the words, each line driving a spike deeper into his heart. Edmund Morrison admitted to killing Thomas Brennan during a business dispute, claimed it was self-defense, but the details painted a picture of cold-blooded murder motivated by greed. The riders were close enough now that Samuel could make out individual faces, hard men with the look of professionals about them. They'd spread out in a line, approaching the ranch with the methodical precision of a hunting party that had finally cornered its prey. "Now you know," Clara said softly. "Your father wasn't the man you thought he was." Samuel sank to his knees beside the open chest, the confession trembling in his hands. 23 years of believing in his father's righteousness crumbled like a house built on sand. Every lesson about honor and integrity, every proud moment of carrying the Morrison name, all of it built on a foundation of lies and blood. "I loved him," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "even when he was hard on me, even when he never seemed satisfied with anything I did. I loved him. I thought he was teaching me to be a good man." Clara knelt beside him, her earlier fear replaced by something that looked almost like compassion. "He was still your father," she said gently. "Whatever he did, that doesn't change the man who raised you, who taught you right from wrong." "But it does," Samuel replied, looking up at her with eyes full of anguish. "Don't you see, if he could do this, if he could kill a man and steal his land, then what does that make me? What if that darkness is in my blood too?" The riders had reached the edge of his property now, their horses snorting and stamping as they formed a semicircle around the barn. Samuel could see the leader clearly, a tall man with silver hair, and the bearing of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. This had to be one of Thomas Brennan's brothers. Clara reached out and touched Samuel's hand where it rested on the confession. Her fingers were warm despite the chill in the air, and for a moment he felt anchored by that simple human contact. "I've spent 20 years running from the truth of that night," she said. 20 years believing that staying silent was the same as staying alive. But living with a lie isn't living at all, it's just another kind of death. Samuel looked at her, really looked at her, and saw past the weathered features and the weight of years to the woman in the photograph. She'd been beautiful once, but more than that, she'd been brave. It took courage to come back here, to face the truth even knowing it might destroy her. "They'll hang me," he said, "even if I give them what they want, even if I tell them everything, they'll hang me for what my father did." "Maybe," Clara agreed, "or maybe they'll see that you're not him. Maybe they'll understand that some sins don't pass from father to son like land or livestock." From outside came the sound of spurs jingling as boots hit the ground. The leader's voice carried across the yard, calm but implacable. "Mrs. Brennan, we know you're in there. Come out and bring whatever you found. It's time this family had some answers." Samuel closed his eyes and thought about the ranch he'd built, the cattle he'd raised, the quiet life he'd carved out of this unforgiving landscape. All of it might end today, but Clara was right. Living with a lie wasn't really living. He stood up, the confession still in his hand, and helped Clara to her feet. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The truth might destroy him, but at least it would be honest destruction. "Ready?" he asked. Clara managed a small smile, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her since she'd arrived. "I've been ready for 20 years. Samuel Morrison walked out of his barn with his hands raised, the confession clutched in his right fist, and Clara Whitmore beside him. The 6 riders sat their horses in perfect formation, weapons drawn but not yet aimed. The leader, unmistakably a Brennan, with his brother's strong jaw and piercing blue eyes, studied them with the patience of a man who'd waited decades for this moment. "My name is Robert Brennan," the man said, his voice carrying the authority of wealth and determination. "I believe you have something that belongs to my family." Samuel stepped forward, his legs steadier than he'd expected. "I do," he said simply, and held out the confession. "But first, you need to know that I had nothing to do with what happened to your brother. I was 16 when he died, and I've spent my whole life believing my father was an honorable man." Robert Brennan dismounted and approached slowly, his eyes never leaving Samuel's face. He took the papers and read them in silence, his jaw tightening with each line. When he finished, he looked up at Clara. "You were there that night." "I was," Clara said, her voice steady now. "I saw it all. Your brother came here to buy cattle, but something went wrong during the negotiations. My husband, Thomas, he had a temper when he thought someone was trying to cheat him. Edmund Morrison claimed self-defense in that confession, but I saw him strike first. Thomas never had a chance to draw his gun." Robert's hands clenched around the papers. "Where is he buried?" Samuel felt the weight of 2 decades pressing down on him. "I don't know," he admitted. "The confession doesn't say, and my father never spoke of it. But I'll help you find him. I'll tear this ranch apart stone by stone if that's what it takes." Something shifted in Robert Brennan's expression, not forgiveness, but perhaps understanding. He looked around at the ranch Samuel had built, the careful improvements and honest labor visible in every fence post and water trough. "You're not your father," Robert said finally. "That much is clear." He folded the confession and tucked it inside his coat. "But Thomas Brennan deserves a proper burial, and his family deserves justice, even if it's 20 years late." "What kind of justice?" Samuel asked. "The legal kind," Robert replied. "This confession will reopen the investigation. Your father's name will be cleared of any mystery, but it won't be cleared of murder. As for you," he paused, studying Samuel's face,
You'll testify to what you found, and you'll help us search for Thomas's remains. After that, you'll have to live with the truth about your father, but you won't hang for his sins." Clara stepped forward. "And me, you're free," Robert said simply. "You've carried this burden long enough." 3 months later they found Thomas Brennan's remains in a shallow grave near the creek, along with the clothes he'd worn that night, and the leather satchel containing the money he'd brought to buy cattle. The trial made headlines across the territory, but by then, Samuel Morrison had already sold his ranch and disappeared. Some said he'd gone north to Montana, others claimed he'd headed west to California. But Clara Whitmore, who'd taken back her maiden name and started a new life in Denver, knew the truth. She'd received a letter postmarked from a small town in Oregon, with no return address but a few lines in Samuel's careful handwriting. "Found a place where the past can't follow. The man who raised me may have been a killer, but he also taught me that hard work can redeem almost anything, building something good from something broken. Thank you for showing me the difference between living and hiding." She kept that letter in her Bible until the day she died, a reminder that sometimes the truth doesn't destroy, sometimes it sets you free. The last golden light of autumn faded behind the mountains, and the empty Morrison ranch stood silent in the gathering darkness, its secrets finally laid to rest.